On February 14th, 2006, while most people celebrated Valentine's Day, a mother of three was brutally murdered in her own home in Montgomery, Alabama. Nearly 2 decades later, on February 6, 2025, the state of Alabama executed the man convicted of her killing. This is the story of Demetrius Terrence Frazier and a crime that shocked a community. Demetrius Terrence Frazier was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. Before his arrest, very little about his early life made headline. He was not a stranger to the criminal justice system, having had previous encounters with law enforcement, but nothing that would predict the violent crime he would eventually be convicted of committing. By 2006, Frazier was in his mid-30s living in Montgomery. Those who knew him described him as someone who had struggled with stability throughout his adult life. He had worked various jobs, but never seemed to find solid footing. Friends and family would later say that he had battled personal demons, though the full extent of his struggles only became clear after his arrest. What is certain is that Demetrius Frazier's name would become forever linked to one of Montgomery's most brutal murders, a crime that would eventually lead him to Alabama's death row. On February 14, 2006, Valentine's Day, 47-year-old Crystal Stillwell was at home in Montgomery, Alabama. Crystal was a mother of 3 children and was known in her community as a caring and hardworking woman. She worked to provide for her family and was beloved by those who knew her. That day, Demetrius Frazier entered Crystal's home. What happened next would devastate her family and shock the local community. According to court records and trial testimony, Frazier attacked Crystal in a violent and brutal manner. The attack was not a random act of violence, but appeared to be targeted and personal. Crystal Stillwell was stabbed multiple times during the assault. The medical examiner would later testify that she suffered numerous wounds, indicating a sustained and vicious attack. She fought for her life, but her injuries were too severe. Crystal died in her own home, leaving behind 3 children who would grow up without their mother. The motive, according to prosecutors, was related to a personal dispute. Some evidence suggested that Frazier and Stillwell knew each other, though the exact nature of their relationship and what triggered such extreme violence remained points of debate during the trial. What was clear was that this was not a crime of opportunity, but a deliberate act of violence that ended an innocent woman's life. The investigation into Crystal Stillwell's murder moved quickly. Montgomery Police Department detectives collected evidence from the crime scene, including forensic evidence that would prove crucial in identifying the killer. Witnesses came forward with information, and within days, suspicion fell on Demetrius Frazier. Frazier was arrested and charged with capital murder. Under Alabama law, certain murders can be prosecuted as capital offenses, making the defendant eligible for the death penalty. The murder of Crystal Stillwell, due to its brutal nature and specific circumstances, qualified as a capital case. The trial took place in Montgomery County. Prosecutors presented a strong case built on physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. The prosecution argued that Frazier had deliberately and brutally taken Crystal Stillwell's life, and that the circumstances of the crime warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense team attempted to challenge the evidence and raise doubts about Frazier's guilt. They questioned the reliability of certain witnesses and argued that the prosecution's case had weaknesses. However, the jury found the evidence compelling. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of capital murder. The trial then moved to the sentencing phase, where the same jury would decide whether Demetrius Frazier should receive life in prison without parole or the death penalty. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors highlighted the brutality of the crime, the suffering of the victim, and the impact on her 3 children who lost their mother. The defense presented mitigating factors, including aspects of Frazier's background and mental health, hoping to persuade the jury to show mercy. The jury recommended death. The judge, following Alabama procedure at the time, agreed with the recommendation and formally sentenced Demetrius Terrence Frazier to death. He was sent to Alabama's death row at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, where he would remain for nearly 2 decades. Demetrius Frazier arrived at William C. Holman Correctional Facility in 2007, joining the dozens of other inmates awaiting execution in Alabama. Death row at Holman is a place of isolation and waiting, where condemned prisoners spend years, sometimes decades, as their appeals work through the courts. For 18 years, Frazier lived in this environment. Death row inmates are typically housed in single cells with limited contact with others. They spend 23 hours a day in their cells, with minimal recreation time. It is an existence marked by monotony, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that each day could bring news about execution dates. During his time on death row, Frazier's case went through the standard appeals process. This included direct appeals to the Alabama Court of Criminal and the Alabama Supreme Court, as well as federal habeas corpus petitions. His attorneys raised various legal issues, challenging aspects of his trial, conviction, and sentence. These appeals are a normal part of the capital punishment process in the United States. They serve as safeguards, ensuring that defendants received fair trials and that no constitutional rights were violated. However, in Frazier's case, each level of appeal was denied. Courts consistently upheld his conviction and death sentence. Little is publicly known about how Frazier spent his years on death row. Some inmates use this time for reflection, education, or religious study. Others struggle with mental health issues brought on by the isolation and stress of awaiting execution. Family visits, when they occur, provide brief respites from the monotony. But many death row inmates gradually lose contact with the outside world as years turn into decades. For Frazier, those 18 years eventually came to an end in early 2025. In late 2024, Alabama set an execution date for Demetrius Terrence Frazier, February 6, 2025. After exhausting his appeals and with no last-minute stays granted by the courts, the execution would proceed as scheduled. The days leading up to an execution follow a strict protocol at Holman Correctional Facility. The condemned inmate is moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. They are allowed final visits from family members, spiritual advisors, and attorneys. They can request a final meal, though Alabama has restrictions on what can be provided. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius Frazier spent his final hours at Holman. The method of execution in Alabama is typically lethal injection, though the state has also used nitrogen hypoxia in recent executions. The specific method used for Frazier has been reported as lethal injection, following the state's established protocol. If Frazier made any final statement, it would have been recorded and potentially shared with the media and the victim's family. Some condemned inmates use their final words to express remorse, maintain their innocence, or offer messages to loved ones. Others choose to remain silent. The execution was carried out on schedule. According to standard procedure, witnesses were present, including representatives from the prison, media witnesses, and potentially family members of both the victim and the condemned. The process, from the administration of the lethal drugs to the pronouncement of death, typically takes several minutes. At the conclusion of the procedure, officials pronounced Demetrius Terrence Frazier dead. He was 60 years old. His execution marked the end of a legal process that had lasted nearly 2 decades, from the crime in 2006 to his death in 2025. Crystal Stillwell's family was notified of the execution. For them, the day represented a form of closure, though no execution can truly bring back a loved one or erase the pain of loss. Her children, now adults, had lived most of their lives without their mother, and this execution represented the final chapter in a long and painful journey through the justice system. The case of Demetrius Frazier did not generate the same level of controversy or national attention as some other death penalty cases. There were no widespread claims of innocence or significant questions about whether the wrong person had been convicted. The evidence presented at trial appeared to be solid, and multiple levels of courts reviewed and upheld the conviction. However, Frazier's execution took place against the broader backdrop of ongoing debates about capital punishment in America. Alabama is one of the states that continues to actively use the death penalty, even as other states have abolished it or imposed moratoriums. Critics of the death penalty argue that it is an inhumane practice, that it risks executing innocent people, and that it is applied unevenly across racial and economic lines. Supporters contend that it serves justice for the most heinous crimes and provides closure for victims' families. Frazier's case also occurred during a period when Alabama has faced scrutiny over its execution methods. The state has experimented with nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative to lethal injection, following difficulties in obtaining the drugs used in traditional lethal injection protocols. These developments have sparked debates about whether new execution methods constitute cruel and unusual punishment. For Crystal Stillwell's family and friends, the execution represented justice served after a long wait. For others concerned about the death penalty more broadly, it represented another instance of state-sanctioned killing that they believe should be abolished. The story of Demetrius Terrence Frazier is ultimately a tragedy on multiple levels. A woman lost her life in a brutal attack. 3 children grew up without their mother. And after 18 years on death row, a man was executed by the state. Cases like this force us to confront difficult questions about justice, punishment, and whether society should have the power to take a life in response to murder. There are no easy answers, and people of good faith disagree deeply on these issues. What is clear is that Crystal Stillwell deserved better than the violence that ended her life. Her memory lives on through her children and those who loved her. The criminal justice system worked through its process, from investigation to trial to appeals to execution, taking nearly 2 decades to reach its conclusion. Whether that process served justice and whether the death penalty itself is just remains a question each person must answer for themselves. What we can do is remember the victims, understand the legal processes involved, and continue to have honest conversations about one of the most serious powers the state can exercise. The case of Demetrius Frazier is now closed, but the larger questions it raises about crime, punishment, and justice continue. Subscribe to True Crime Death Sentence for more real death row stories.